wastewater operator certification series. So this is the fifth one out of 10. So after this, we'll be halfway through. So thank you all for being here, whether this is your first one or your fifth one. So um, hopefully you get some useful information out of this. Okay, just really quickly about me. My name is Tucker Colvin, and I'm with the Southwest Environmental Finance Center at UNM, but I'm actually based in Billings, Montana. So I'm living up here now and leading some of our work in the EPA Region 8. And there's my email there. And then there's AJ. If you want to introduce yourself real quick, AJ.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's AJ. I am a research engineer with the Southwest Environmental Finance Center. I've been a wastewater operator, a compliance officer in wastewater. Been in the field for about 13 years now, and I'm a level 4 operator. So just a little bit about my background.
Thank you, AJ. Yeah, okay, and then here's just our agenda for this wastewater series. So we're on the fifth session today, treatment ponds and fixed film media. And then you can see all the next trainings coming up, so please join us for those. Okay, so for the lagoons, so I'm going to use ponds and lagoons interchangeably for this. So just so you know, they're the same thing. Don't want to trip anybody up on vocabulary. So you'll see them called lagoons or ponds, or sewage ponds or holes in the ground, or probably lots of different things, but they're the same thing. Okay, so we're just going to go over what they are and how they work, the different types of ponds and the biology in them, operation maintenance. We're going to go over a little bit of the analysis and regulations, like the measurements and stuff you can do. We're going to talk a bit about safety and then some math. Okay. All right, so just to begin, what is a wastewater treatment pond or a lagoon? So you can see one right here, and this is one in New Mexico, and you can see it pretty much just looks like a lake, an artificially created lake with a plastic liner around it. And then in this one, you can see that they have an aerator in the middle, floating out there. And so it pretty much is a very simple way to treat wastewater, especially for smaller communities. So lagoons really are the oldest form of wastewater treatment because they're very low, like low tech. So just a pond, it's a hole in the ground. And then it's all just natural processes that do the treatment. So they're utilized in storage, sedimentation, and contaminant removal processes. So that means that the water just flows into these, or a big body of water where the water slows down, and then the solids can settle out via gravity, which we went over last session. And then that helps remove a lot of those contaminants. So then whether they're discharging or not, the water is a lot cleaner. So they're used for all kinds of different things, domestic wastewater, of course, but they're also used for industrial and agricultural wastewater treatment. So a lot of times like feed plants have some of these, or meat packing plants use lagoons. We'll talk a little bit about those. They use microbes, and that's kind of the whole way these things operate. There is some sedimentation, physical processes, of course, but the microbes are really doing a lot of the work on getting rid of those nutrients. And they're most common in small communities, although not exclusively, but that's generally the case. And they're actually 25%, so a quarter of all the publicly owned treatment works in the United States are lagoons. So it seems like in this webinar, there's probably more smaller communities and larger cities, of course. So lagoons are more common, and they're also more common in certain parts of the United States. And we'll go over kind of why that is. Okay, so what are some of the advantages and disadvantages? One advantage is they're cheap. They're relatively cheap compared to any other kind of mechanical system because they're pretty much just an artificial lake. That's how they work. Minimal upkeep. There's not a lot you have to do to maintain it. Of course, there is some stuff you have to maintain, but not as much as like a mechanical plant. And then, yeah, the minimal equipment, they're pretty simple. So you don't need staff that are highly trained. They your staff may do wastewater and drinking water as well, or maybe do trash. So you don't need to have somebody with that really high level of specialized knowledge necessarily. They're energy efficient. So they have less moving systems. So of course, less energy required. Yeah, and then that minimal environmental impact because you don't need a lot of electricity for doing this kind of stuff. It's all just utilizing these natural processes. So the disadvantages are it takes a lot of land. So they're big ponds that take up a lot of surface area. So that's one of the reasons why they're in more rural areas, of course, because land has to be abundant and relatively affordable. They also are affected by seasonal changes quite a bit because they are big ponds, they're relatively shallow. They're going to be pretty much the same temperature as the ambient air. And of course, that's going to make a difference in how well they're treating the wastewater. The treatment capabilities can be limited. And this is generally true, but of course you can have lagoons with like multiple series in them. And so the treatment can be pretty good, but they're not going to get you at quite the level of a mechanical plant. They can have odor issues, and that is because you're going to have these big lakes full of sewage that is being treated. Although depending on how you're kind of operating and managing that, you can really reduce the odors. And then because they're kind of a slow moving process, this water is flowing into these lakes. It's a slow process. They're going to be there for many days, maybe months, perhaps. So if there's something that disrupts them, it can take you quite a bit of time to get that proper function back together. Okay, and then so how do they work? So, and this is a community. This is actually the same lagoon, just a different angle from it. So there's wastewater is coming in from this community over here. It flows down, and actually this community has a lift station that pumps the wastewater from that lift station into the lagoon. And then the solids settle out due to gravity as they come in because it's a very slow moving body of water. So everything settles out, or everything that can settle out will. And the microbes consume the organic content in that wastewater. And then depending on what kind of lagoon that treated wastewater is discharged, although a lot of it will evaporate along the way. And then periodically, everything that settles out and that sludge that's at the bottom, you will have to remove that on occasion. And that can be variable depending on your community, how big your lagoons are, but maybe something around every 20 years or something. So it's not super frequent. Okay, so just kind of talking about the different types of wastewater treatment ponds. The first categorization is whether they discharge or not. So depending on where you are, you're going to have different types of these categories, whether they're discharging. So that means there's water flowing in from your community into that lagoon, and then it's flowing out. This can be constant, whether like at the same rate of it flowing in or flowing out, or it can be pumped out in batches. So maybe you only pump water out a couple times a year based on seasonality and stuff of when it starts to fill up. And of course, if they're discharging, you're going to need a permit for that, whether it's a NPDES permit or if it's on like state managed land, you might need a state permit. And then so the other type then is a non-discharging lagoon. And these are called evaporative lagoons. And so that's what this one is. This is in Quemada, New Mexico. They don't have a discharge permit at all. So everything that goes into here, it either settles out and then the water evaporates. So this, of course, can only be in locations where the amount of precipitation is less than the amount of evaporation. So you don't want these to fill up with water, of course. So this is only in dry locations where you can have an evaporative lagoon. Of course, you still might need a permit to operate these because they still are considered publicly owned treatment works. So, but that's going to depend on your regulatory agency. And then kind of also in this non-discharging lagoon category is these lagoons that they technically discharge, but you're using that water for irrigation. And a lot of times this is used for golf courses. So then you don't necessarily need that NPDES permit because you're applying that onto something like a golf course. And I know there's some communities that have constructed a golf course specifically because they thought it's easier to build a golf course and use this water to irrigate the golf course than it would be to get an NPDES permit. Because those standards are lower if you're going to sprinkle this onto some grass versus whether it's going into a body of water. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about another category of wastewater treatment ponds. So this is whether they're aerobic or anaerobic. And so first, the aerobic or the aerated ponds. So these ponds, they use oxygen. So that aerobic, that just means with oxygen. So if you hear the term aerobic, anaerobic, aerobic means utilizing oxygen, anaerobic is without oxygen. So in aerobic or aerated ponds, those microorganisms use oxygen and then they use respiration for their microbial processes, just like we do. We utilize oxygen for respiration. That's how we function and you do our human bodily processes. And then that's different than opposite is anaerobic. So that's when microorganisms they thrive in situations that lack oxygen. And so they have different metabolic functions. So they convert that organic matter, that carbon, into methane and then carbon dioxide. So they have different pathways to treat that wastewater. And then facultative. So this really is a combination of both. So this is the aerobic and the anaerobic. So the lagoons are stratified. So you have oxygenated on the top, and then on the bottom is this anoxic zone. So there are different chemical reactions, different functions going on in these different areas. And these facultative lagoons, utilizing this facultative bacteria, these microorganisms, they really are the most common because they kind of do both in one. Okay, and just to look at some visuals of what these look like. This is a graphic I took from a presentation from Mike Tate at the Wichita State University Environmental Finance Center. So some of our colleagues there. So I really liked his graphic though, so I took his graphic for my slides. So on the top, you can see these aerated lagoons. And so you can just see some of the mechanisms that are used for this aeration. This is on the left is that aerator. This is similar to that one that Kamado has. And so it kind of just mixes the water, mixing in some oxygen for those microbes to utilize that oxygen for their respiratory processes. And then on the right, you have these air diffusers. So they kind of bubble up oxygen from the bottom. And so both of these, even if you have these diffusers or the mixer on top, there still is going to be some sludge on the bottom of those that sinks down. Okay, and then on the bottom left is this anaerobic lagoon. And so these are more common in like industrial agricultural facilities, and sometimes they even have a cover on top because they don't want oxygen in there. And those are really for treating wastewater with a really high BOD content. So they need some like heavy, like lots of like BOD removal for places that have a lot of high nutrient waste. And then on the bottom right is the facultative lagoon. So this is really just utilizing both processes. So there's this aerobic zone on the top and then anaerobic on the bottom. And then there's this facultative zone kind of in the middle. So best of all the worlds.
Okay. So we do have another question, and how often for the aerated lagoons should the aerator be in use?
You know, I guess it would probably be just dependent on your system. So here's a picture of this zoomed in. This is the float in the Kamado lagoon. And so this I think they have on just all the time. And so this is just like mixing the water. And this one has solar panels and it's chained to the bottom, has some weights. And so it just is sitting in the middle of this lagoon, just going all the time. And so, and that's because in Kamado they used to have two lagoons and one went down. So now they only have one lagoon. So they wanted a little bit better functionality in that one, I believe was kind of the idea. And so by adding oxygen, there's a bit more of this aerobic processes. So the lagoon was functioning a little bit better. So this is still considered a facultative lagoon. There's still both that aerobic and anaerobic processes going on. But at the top, they just wanted to add some more oxygen to kind of increase that. So, yeah, but I'd love to hear what other people, if they use aeration, what they use. But I think the idea is that you generally want to have that aeration going on all the time.
Right. And then I think in the case, a lot of these manufacturers called Solar Bee that manufactures mixers like this and aerators. And so they're only going to operate during the daytime. Um, but it's important to move stuff around and add air so that the good bugs grow and you get that aerobic process.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. That's a good point. Yeah, because they're solar powered, and I doubt this has that great of batteries like on it to run all night. So yeah, so it's only going to run when there's sun. So yeah, thanks. Okay, so this one is in a facultative lagoon, but there are lagoons that are specifically aerobic lagoons, and for those ones, they're going to have a pretty shallow depth because if you want oxygen throughout the whole profile, you want that to be pretty shallow, so you don't want because it's harder for the oxygen to get deeper down in there. So something like 3 to 5 feet maybe. And then this loading rate of maybe 15 to 20 pounds of BOD per acre per day, or a little bit more if it's mechanically aerated. And then a relatively short detention time for those. And they're oftentimes used as polishing. So we'll go over this in a minute, but in a series, you might have an aerobic pond at the end of your series, or you could even have this after another kind of wastewater treatment method to kind of get that last bit of treatment to meet your discharge limits if you are having a hard time meeting those goals. Yeah, and then also that because they're so shallow, that UV does kill some of the pathogens as it leaves the lagoon too. Okay, and then some of the details for the anaerobic pond. So this is without oxygen. These are quite a bit deeper because there's a lot more sludge going on there. We don't want oxygen, and so sometimes greater than 20 feet. A lot higher BOD, so 200 to 1,000 BOD per acre per day. And then detention time can really vary depending on what these are used for and how they're designed, what they're for. And like I said, they're usually for industrial waste. And not used as often for domestic wastewater, just because there's not that high BOD. It kind of works similar to like a digester would with all that, with just a lot of BOD high sludge. Okay. Okay, and then that facultative lagoon, these are kind of the mixture of the two. So it has a medium depth 4 to 8 feet. Of course, this could depend based on your community, how big your community is, how big the lagoon is. Kind of a medium loading rate, 15 to 20 pounds of BOD per acre per day. And the detention time, it could be relatively short, but it could be way longer than this too. So it seems like it could be up to like 3 or 4 months. Um, and this is, of course, this could change a lot depending on your community. I know there's a lot of communities in the West that are very seasonal. So, of course, you're going to have a lot more um, inflow during the summer month if you're a more touristy kind of place or whatever it may be. Um, and then this kind of goes through a little bit of the biology. So there is like that kind of the aerobic layer on top and the anaerobic layer on the bottom. So that anaerobic layer, it produces some hydrogen sulfide, and then that is generally consumed by the aerobic layer. That of course can also cause some smell issues. So if these are functioning properly, you can minimize that smell. Um, and then I'm going to go a little bit more into the kind of the science here in one slide. Oh, and I see your message, Larry. How often do you move water from cell to cell? So I think generally it's continuously flowing from one cell to the other cell. I think that's a typical design. I'd be curious if somebody has any other insight on that. So Larry asked, yeah, how often do you move water from one cell to the other cell in a sequential, like a series? I think um, yeah, what you're referring to, Larry. So yeah, I'd love to hear what other people think, but I think that's generally continuous, flowing from one to the next to the next. Okay, so now I'm just going to go over some lagoon components. So I think this is a very scenic lagoon. If anyone knows where this at, put it in where this lagoon is located, put it in the chat and you get a bonus point. So all right, I think that's a pretty nice lagoon there. Very scenic. Okay. So a minute ago we mentioned liners. And so this is kind of just highlighting the liner of a lagoon. Oh, and I'll just note, I did screenshot all of these images for these next series of slides from an animation that one of our coworkers made, and he goes over all the processes of the lagoon. So that link is in one of these last slides toward my presentation, but I recommend you checking out his animation. I think it really helps visualize some of these scientific processes, and he does a really good job. We have some great other animations that he does, but that's where I got all these. Okay, so like we discussed earlier, this liner can be multiple different things. A lot of times it's HDPE, so that plastic liner. It's black, like the ones in the images that we showed earlier. And then it can also be bentonite or clay, which is just like natural substances that's just really tight, little compact particles that are packed together. And if it is clay or bentonite, so that natural material, there is a lot more seepage. So seeping out of it can be something like 5 or 10% of the what's flowing in could seep out of it. So sometimes even the engineers will design that because even 5 or 10% of the flow can be a significant amount. Okay, and then so in this aerated zone, this is where the nitrogen and the phosphorus are being removed. And so that nitrogen, it comes through into the lagoon as ammonia, and then the nitrification turns it into nitrate, and then nitrate, then nitrate, and then the denitrification, that process turns it into nitrogen gas. And that's all done with bacteria. And then the phosphorus, it's coming in as wastewater, but unlike nitrogen and carbon, there is no gaseous form of phosphorus. And so the phosphorus can't leave into the atmosphere like the nitrogen and the carbon can. So this phosphorus, it is consumed by the bacteria and is munched up, and then it either precipitates out, or that the phosphorus is actually in the dead bacteria cells and they settle out. So that's kind of how that process works a bit. Okay, and also in this aerobic zone, so this is towards the top of a lagoon, whether it's aerated or if it's just a facultative lagoon. So there's also oxygen coming in at the top, and that's coming in due to wind. Wind is actually going to make the top of the lagoon a little choppy, and it gets incorporated into the water. But also there's this algae that's going to be growing on top, and the algae is adding oxygen to the water through photosynthesis. Okay, and then the bacteria, they're going to use that oxygen that's in the water, and they are going to use that to convert it through respiration back to carbon dioxide. So that same process we're doing, we're taking in oxygen, we're breathing oxygen, we're exhaling carbon dioxide. So it's the same process. So that's how they're going to get rid of a lot of that carbon in the wastewater. Okay, so just to go over those processes in a little more detail. So the algae at the top, they produce oxygen through that photosynthesis. And then the aerobic bacteria, so that bacteria that use oxygen, they reduce the BOD, and they convert that carbon into CO2 that then is released into the air. That CO2, it can also be utilized by algae. So they're using that CO2 with sunlight for photosynthesis. And then that nitrification, it converts the ammonia to nitrite, then to nitrate. And then the denitrification process happens, which then converts that nitrate into nitrogen gas. So if you want to learn more about that process, there's a ton of, you can go into the actual the chemistry of that and how it moves around and kind of what and the organisms that do that. There's like nitrobacters and stuff, but I'm not going to go too much into that process. But there's a lot of information out there, and please let us know if you have any questions about that. Okay, and then also I want to talk about this diurnal cycle. So one thing that I mentioned in the last couple of slides is sunlight, so the photosynthesis. Of course, just like that mixer that uses those solar panels, the algae is not going to have sun at nighttime, so this process is going to change. And this is called a diurnal cycle. So diurnal just meaning it changes throughout the day. Okay, so just to kind of go over this process. So during that day, the algae performs photosynthesis, so it's taking in energy from sunlight, and it is taking in CO2, both from the air and the water, and it's adding oxygen through the water or into the water. And so then that oxygen in the water is used by the bacteria for respiration, and it treats that wastewater. And then during the night, when sunlight isn't available, photosynthesis stops, but respiration continues. So that consumes oxygen in the lagoon. And so this process means that during the daytime, there's less CO2 in the water, and CO2, that is a weak acid. So it mixes with the water to create carbonic acid, and so that decreases the pH. So acid, remember, on our pH scale, more acidic is lower, more basic is higher pH. So that increased CO2, that acid is going to decrease that pH. And then during the nighttime, that increased CO2 in the water is going to decrease the pH. So because that photosynthesis process starts. Okay, and then here's this graph that I took this graphic again from Mike Tate at Wichita State University, EFC. So you can kind of see this graph, and this is a 2-day period on this graph. And you can see we're starting out as it's about midnight. So at nighttime, you can see we're getting lower and lower dissolved oxygen and lower pH. So as the sun comes up, that photosynthesis starts happening, and then it's adding oxygen into the water. So our DO is going to go way up. And then as it gets to be night again, it's going to go back down. And this can fluctuate quite a bit. And so then that pH too. So if you think of pH, it's going to be really dictated in this process by the amount of carbon dioxide in the water, or which turns to carbonic acid. So the more of that, the lower the pH is going to be. So at night is when that pH goes down. During the day, it's going to increase, and then it's going to go back down again. And so you can see this fluctuates quite a bit. So if you're taking samples of DO or pH in your lagoon, try to do it at the same time every day, or else you're not gonna be measuring kind of the same thing. You're gonna be comparing apples to oranges. So try to do it consistently. Okay, so now going down into that anaerobic zone. So this is where that bacteria is functioning without oxygen. So this is really taking that heavier carbon-rich material, converting it to methane and carbon dioxide. Okay, so how this is kind of happening is these microorganisms, they hydrolyze proteins, carbohydrates, fats, and turn them into fatty acids, amino acids, and sugars. And then those are then metabolized into organic acids and volatile fatty acids through acidogenesis. And then the methanogens convert that organic acids and those volatile fatty acids into methane and CO2. And so that's a lot of fancy words, but the basic idea is that throughout this process, these different types of organisms, they're going to take these longer, more complex carbon chains, such as like proteins, carbohydrates, things that are bigger. They're going to take those and break them up into smaller and more manageable bits. And eventually, they're going to break them apart, and eventually they'll turn them into carbon dioxide and methane, so the most simple forms of carbon. So that's really the idea, is that it's just going from longer, more complex things into simpler and simpler and simpler things until it can become in its gaseous state. So a lot easier to remove, I guess. Yeah, so that really removes that BOD, and also it takes care of some nutrients as well. Okay, and here's a graphic that I think is kind of helpful. It's not the best quality graphic, so my apologies. But it kind of just goes over some of these processes in a little kind of a nice schematic. So on the left over here, you can see where that raw wastewater is coming in. Some of this stuff, some of the bigger particles are to settle out. And so then you can see in this anaerobic layer we were just talking about, starts out with these longer organics, breaks them down into some simpler organics, and then converts them into like carbon dioxide, some ammonia, and methane. And then the aerobic zone, it kind of is more of the cellular respiration and photosynthesis kind of process. Um, the algae is adding oxygen, the bacteria is using that oxygen, it's converting this nitrogen and phosphorus into that like cellular into their bodies, and then it's also releasing that nitrogen into the air. So it's kind of I kind of like this graphic because it kind of simplifies things a little bit, a good visual. Yeah, but it's these processes we just went over. Okay, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about this pond configuration now. Um, So depending on what kind of scenarios you're in, these different configurations can be helpful. So a lot of ponds are used in a series. So there's a sequence of different kinds of lagoons and different characteristics, one after another. They can be ran parallel. So that's just water going into equally into two different ponds and then doing that process and then flowing out or evaporating. You could have these oxidation ponds in series. So these could be mechanically aerated ponds, which are preceded by a clarifier, and that just means that there's a like a big clarifier at the before them, so that's taking in a lot of the settlable solids. So then the water going into this lagoon is going to have a lower BOD. And then sometimes these ponds can just be for polishing. So maybe they're after another kind of wastewater treatment process and they're just used to polish or just improve that water quality just a little bit before it flows out into another water body or wherever it may go. Okay, so here's just a diagram of a series operation. So in this situation, you can see there's three ponds. There's this first one that in this graphic they call it an anaerobic pond, but it looks like it is more of just like a facultative because there's not like a liner on the top. But it is going to have a lot more of that anaerobic process because it's going to have a lot more of the settlable solids, going to have a much thicker sludge layer on the bottom. You can see it's deeper than the other ones. So there's going to be more of that anaerobic process in there and not as much oxygen. And then it's going to flow into the second facultative lagoon. And so there's going to be more oxygen flowing into this one. It's still going to have some of that anaerobic processes going on at the bottom, some of that sludge layer. And then the third one is going to be even shallower and it's going to have more oxygen going on in there. And so that's going to kind of finish kind of removing some of that nitrate and or the nitrogen and phosphorus. Okay. And so with any lagoons, especially in this diagram is with ones in scenarios and or with in sequence, I mean. And this is another graphic I took from Mike Tate with Wichita State University. So ideally, we want to utilize the whole volume and the whole surface area of our lagoon. So if you have a situation like maybe on the right here, that if we ignore these red dotted lines for a second, if we have the water flowing in over here, it could really easily just go pretty quickly straight towards this outlet. And especially here, it flows in here and it might just go straight out there. So that really is decreasing the functionality of these lagoons. We're not utilizing the whole volume and area of these. And so ideally, this is prevented through good design. So like in this example, flowing in over here and then flowing out at the complete opposite end and same over here. So it utilizes that whole volume or that whole area. But if you have a situation that's already installed like this and you're experiencing short circuiting, you can install these baffles or or they're called like curtains. And so this really is like a plastic kind of tarp that goes down in the middle of the lagoon. And then there's a hole over here where this red square is, a rectangle, where the water has to go all the way over here and then flow through. So it makes it utilize the full surface area of that lagoon. So if you're experiencing like poor lagoon function, um, and this might be a problem, this could be really helpful to address this. And you can figure this out numerous ways. You could put some like dye in there, but I've seen a lot of people put oranges in there. So just dump a crate of oranges where the water is flowing in, and then just see where they float, see where they go. And if they go just straight towards the outlet, then you know you have some short circuiting issues. And it's good to use oranges too, because then they just biodegrade. You don't have much like plastic duckies or something in your lagoons at the end. Okay, and then in winter, decreased microbial activity can be caused by that decreased temperature. So for every 10 degrees of temperature change of the air and thus water, there's going to be about half as much microbial activity. And so this is a significant issue, especially up here in places in the northern part of the country, but pretty much everywhere in the West. This is going to have an impact no matter what, because 10 degrees that can happen every day, whether you're in Oklahoma or Montana, wherever you may be. So sometimes um, operations switch to parallel as opposed to sequence when it's winter to kind of even out that flow between two ponds instead of having different sequences, have a little more time in like one facultative situation. And winter can also be harmful because it can really flip the profile of that lagoon. So colder temperature water is more dense than warmer water, so it can sink down and kind of mix up your whole lagoon, and that can be really unhelpful for your processes and just overall decreases the temperature throughout your lagoon. Kind of like what happens in lakes too, in colder climates. And then, of course, they can freeze. So if there's freezing on the top of your lake, there's not going to be a lot of oxygen exchange throughout in your lagoon, of course, because you have that layer of ice. Um, so something that can help with this is aeration. So in this picture on the right, you can see they have all these air diffusers in there, and they're creating places like melted where there's no ice. So there can be still some oxygen happening in there. Okay, and then I was going to put a poll in here, but I thought I'd more just write for a discussion, because a lot of you are all over the Western US. So do you have issues with your lagoons freezing? And if you do, put it in the chat. Let us know what you do about freezing, right, to prevent your lagoons from freezing, or maybe you just let them freeze and you don't discharge in the winter, and then you just have those processes happen in the spring or in the summer after you get some microbial processes, then you discharge. So let us know what you do. And I know a lot of you are evaporative lagoons, so you just kind of let it be, I imagine. But love to hear from people who actually operate these to see what you do. Because a lot of times you all can learn a lot better from each other than from us, because you're the ones out there every day. Okay, I'm going to go through this next section relatively quick because I'm running out of time here. But again, we are recording this, and I'm going to send out these slides probably tomorrow. So if you need to revisit these, there's some opportunities. Okay, so I'm going to go over these next concepts: scum control, odor control, weed and vegetation upkeep, levee maintenance, and sludge removal. Okay, so scum, that's kind of like these like fats, fogs, oils, and greases that kind of come in. They have lower specific gravity, so they rise to the top of your pond. So they can cause some problems, and they can cause odor issues. So they can be decreased in numerous ways. Sometimes aeration can even help this, kind of like mixing up into the process of of like into the wastewater processes. If it's a big problem, you can get things that will skim off the fogs, the fats, oil, and greases from the top. Or if there's a lot of scum on the top, they can indicate that there's been a change in that biological activity. So like kind of just less biological activity happening, especially in colder months. So yeah, so that can prevent that. I'm just looking at our chat. So thanks for putting in some of the what you do about freezing. That's really helpful. Okay, yeah, don't discharge till spring. Perfect. You have a mixer, keep water moving in the winter. That's great. And then yeah, the top freezes, but not really causing any issues. So great, thank you. It's good to know. Okay, odor control. So odors can cause overloading. So meaning there's just more nutrients going into there. Um, So sometimes you can divert your influent into another lagoon if you have it. A lot of times, of course, if you don't have another lagoon or something, that can't really happen. But sometimes aeration can help with this or recirculation. Um, Also, maybe you're not utilizing the full area and volume, so maybe you're having some short circuiting or something. Um, can help with that, or maybe you have too much sludge, and it's producing a lot of um, uh, sulfur smell. Okay, and then weeds and vegetation. So pretty much all of the weed and vegetation that grows in here, it's not really helpful for the process. It decreases the amount of wind that's blowing and increasing the oxygen in there. It can create habitat for things like mosquitoes, which you don't want. And try to avoid using herbicides just because this is water that's going a lot of times being discharged into a um, another body of water. So that's not helpful for going into there. And you want to make sure that you're having these biologically processes unhindered. So herbicides can be harmful for that. Okay, levee maintenance is just with general maintenance of everything. Make sure there's nothing, just monitor to make sure that your berms around your lagoons are functional. And you don't want plants that have deep tap roots that can go down and cause issues, whether it's a plastic liner or whether it's clay or bentonite. And sometimes you can be fixed with like some riprap, so meaning a lot of rocks and stuff in there, kind of reduce erosion. But ideally, you catch things and maintain things so that vegetation doesn't have too much. And I see a question. Yeah, does vegetation help with remediation at all? What about a constructed wetland? So yeah, I don't think you necessarily want vegetation in your lagoon because a constructed wetland has a little bit different functionality. So I think I'm definitely not an expert in constructed wetlands and that like kind of utilizing those green natural processes. But I think the idea is that it's going to be a bit more of like a marsh with some like more utilizing a lot more of that um those natural processes like plants to filter stuff out, maybe a little shallower. So I don't know. I'd love to hear if anybody else has any answers to your question. Yeah, does vegetation help with remediation at all? What about constructed wetlands? Um, so yeah, I think it would if you have a constructed wetland, but I think the lagoon processes um, would be, I think, two different kind of categories is what I would say there. Okay. Sludge removal. Um, you should check your sludge annually, see where it's at. It's going to accumulate every once in a while, and it does need to be removed. I've heard about 20 years, but of course, this is going to vary a lot depending on your community. And so, of course, the more sludge you have, you're going to have less volume for treating that wastewater. So as it accumulates, um, less and less of that aerobic zone. Yeah, and so it can be cleared out every so often. I've heard of people actually like kind of going in and like kind of mixing up that sludge a little bit to get a little bit more of the microbial processes to maybe decrease that volume a little bit before you have to remove that sludge. But I don't know, it might be a tricky game to play. Might mess up your operations more than it's worth. So be curious if people do that, if they kind of mix up their sludge layer to see if they can decrease it more before they have to remove it. And contractors will come in and do this for you, and they take equipment and they just haul it out and land apply it or bury it.
Hey, Tucker,
Yep.
we had a question, does vegetation help with remediation at all? And what about a constructed wetland? So, does vegetation help with a lagoon type of situation, or does it hinder it? Do you know? And, what about something like green infrastructure in a constructed wetland?
Yeah, well, I think I was just discussing that. But yeah, I think they're two pretty different processes. I think that constructed wetland um, would be kind of a different scenario and would be made especially for that. I think in a lagoon, you don't necessarily want that because of that liner. I think you're gonna have a lot more seepage. And I think lagoons are, or sorry, constructed wetlands are a little bit more for polishing after another treatment process. I don't think that's 100% of the time. Um, but I think it's a little bit different functionality, different design. And so I think probably keeping that vegetation out of the um, the lagoon would be preferable. But I'd love to hear what other people think. If you have
Hey
any other
Tucker, since you're talking about it again, you're addressing it again. Just real quick, lagoons and constructed wetlands are going to be two different type of processes, like you said. A wetland is going to be more of a polishing process, while a lagoon is going to act more as your primary treatment mechanism. And then also, a lot of that vegetation interferes with the lagoon process, such as like blocking sunlight and stuff like that. And sometimes you do want like or most of the time, you don't want like that big vegetation, but you want like a short grass on your banks to kind of prevent erosion. So that's typically how those two concepts are balanced.
things, Adi, that's helpful. Yeah, that's true. You don't want just like bare dirt because that's gonna have a lot more erosion than something like a grass with some short roots. Yeah, and then Brenda, yeah, your comment about having 2 foot of freeboard. Yeah, I think that is a requirement with pretty much all lagoons. I think is having that. Uh, yeah, I think 2 feet is what I've heard. It could vary a little bit depending on um, maybe who your regulatory agency is, but I think that's definitely really important so you don't have overflows. So like that lagoon that in that first picture, it actually has like a pipe going out, I think at least about 2 feet. And so if it does get up to that point, it will flow out of that pipe as opposed to overflow the lagoon. And I don't know where that pipe went out to. Maybe an artificially constructed wetland. I'm not sure. Um, so yeah, so thank you, Brenda. Okay, and then just a few last things to go over. Just kind of what you want to monitor in your lagoon on occasion is pH, temperature, dissolved oxygen. We talked about that earlier. You want to do that somewhat regularly and at consistent times of the day. Be sure to observe it for any signs of deterioration. Keeping water levels relatively consistent is important because if you have a lagoon that empty or very low levels, that sun damage from like UV can damage the liner especially. So it's good to keep some water in there. And of course, they fluctuate throughout the year depending on what kind of lagoon you have, evaporative or not. But generally better to not keep them empty due to that sun damage. And then it's also good to monitor that BOD, TSS, and other water quality parameters, whether it's flowing in or flowing out, so you can see your percent removal. And that really serves as indicators of how well your lagoon is functioning. And also for your permits, of course, you have to measure those. Okay, sorry, AJ, I'm going a little bit over my hour, but I'll be quick. Okay, so just really quick, pH 7.5 or higher is great. You really want a lot of dissolved oxygen in there, better for these cellular functions. And then pH and dissolved oxygen lower at night, higher in the daytime. Oh yeah, and maybe this will answer your question, Larry, but like different colors indicate different things. So you generally want your lagoons to be green, like deeper green. That means they have enough oxygen and a higher pH. If you have a dull green, that means you have a declining pH and less dissolved oxygen. And then gray means they're overloaded, like you have too much nutrients in there. Um, But I think with you have different ones in sequences, it's because there's gonna be different processes. So and I don't know too much about what the different colors would be for your like anaerobic versus facultative versus aerobic, but I would think that maybe some of those, like maybe a little bit more green for your photosynthetic processes, utilizing that light, maybe would make it a deeper green um in that facultative lagoon that's working well, and then maybe a little lighter color for your aerobic or yeah, aerobic processes. But yeah, I'm not sure actually. So if somebody else has some other thoughts about different colors in your different lagoons in your sequence, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are too. Okay, and then these are just some BOD and TSS kind of indicators, but it's going to be a bit dependent on your specific permits, what you have to remove, what kind of stuff is coming into your system, whether it's just residential, whether there's some industry in there too. I'm just gonna cruise through a little bit because I'm taking up too much time. Okay, so safety considerations, PPE, always use it, always good. Be sure you protect yourself, especially when you're working with raw sewage, for some like pathogenic concerns. But also lagoons, it's a big lake, so if you're going out there, wear your life jacket, have a buddy. Make sure you're being safe for whatever kind of maintenance you're doing. Use that PPE. For wastewater lagoons, you can do all kinds of different math, and we went over these in some of our previous sections. So I'm not going to go over these now, but these are some things that you can use to try to figure out how well your lagoons are functioning. And we're going to have another math one that's more in depth in, I think, July. So stay tuned for that one. Okay, then the last thing I'm going to talk about really quick is just these biodomes, and I'm going to pass over to AJ, because these kind of are a fusion of lagoons and these fixed film media. So these are submerged in the lagoons, and they kind of utilize these domes with a bunch of surface area, and this bacteria attaches onto these like biofilms, and they add oxygen into there, and they treat water as it's like in between all these different layers. And they also protect the bacteria from harmful UV. That's a concern for them. So I know some communities around here use them. So if you use those, put in the chat. It's helpful to know how common things like this are. Okay, and these are the resources I mentioned, but you can check these out later. Send out the slides. Okay, we made it to the break. So
All right, everyone. Tucker, can you see my screen?
yes, I can.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so sorry to cut the break short, but we're just gonna go and get started so we can try to get to our next topic, get all the way through it. So I'm going to be taking over the topic on fixed film media. And the first thing we're going to talk about is what exactly is fixed film media. So fixed film media is a biological / secondary wastewater treatment process that removes nutrients and pollutants from wastewater, utilizing organisms that grow as a fixed film onto a stationary surface or media. And it's sometimes called a slime, is what fixed film can be called as well. Now, like most of our biological treatment, fixed film media mimics mechanisms first observed in the environment. And adding this type of process is important to wastewater treatment because it can remove up to 90% of the wastewater's biological oxygen demand. Now, just a couple quick terms I want to make sure we're familiar with, and Tucker did touch on some of these as well. But the first one is aerobic bacteria, and these are bacteria that live and reproduce only in an environment containing free oxygen. Then there's also facultative bacteria. This is bacteria that uses dissolved oxygen or oxygen from other sources, such as nitrates or sulfates, for respiration. These bacteria in our wastewater treatment processes prefer dissolved oxygen, but can also use other sources when dissolved oxygen is not available. They can live in aerobic or anaerobic conditions. Then the final term that I want to talk about is sloughing. This is when sloughing refers to the breaking off of biological or biomass material from a fixed film media. And this material is usually collected in the effluent of the fixed film processes and settles in a secondary clarifier. So there's a couple different types of fixed film media, and here are the most widely used. The first is trickling filters. And then we also have rotating biological contactors, and I'll be discussing both of these in a little more detail. And then finally, there's integrated fixed film activated sludge. This can also be referred to as moving bed biofilm reactors. This is something that is becoming a little more popular, and these hybrid processes integrate fixed film processes into this activated sludge process. This is when we have some free floating media known as carriers that may look a little bit like this, that have some fixed film on it to perform treatment alongside the activated sludge process that's already occurring. One more thing I want to kind of talk about is Zuglio film. Now, Zuglio film is going to be a common term that you'll see in your wastewater operator certification exams. And it's important because this is where our kind of biological treatment for fixed film media comes from. It's often observed in rivers and other bodies of water. It's a mass of microorganisms such as bacteria, fungi, or protozoa that grow on rocks and other surfaces in contact with bodies of water. Those organisms feed on organic matter in the water that comes into contact with that film, with the Zuglio film. These are often composed of aerobic and facultative organisms, and these are the principles that we apply to our fixed film media treatment. And this is what that typically looks like. This is some rocks in a stream where you can see some of that green and brown material growing on those rocks, and those are bacteria. And this is what we actually mimic in our fixed film media to treat our wastewater. So these microorganism films right now on the stream of water are removing organics from and other nutrients from the water. Then real quick, a kind of brief history of fixed film media in wastewater treatment. So this was first used in the 1890s. This was when the first wastewater plant using fixed film media was established. In the US, the first installation was established in Madison, Wisconsin in 1901. And then trickling filters also became the dominant secondary treatment process in the US during the 1950s. However, it did decline in the 1970s when it was kind of replaced by activated sludge as the dominant technology. It is still used today, and there's been kind of a recent resurgence due to increased efficiency. And it's also utilized more with those integrated novel technologies. Real quick, kind of start us off. Let's go ahead and launch into a poll question. Tucker, if you wouldn't mind starting that. So our question is, bacteria that can survive in both aerobic and anaerobic conditions are known as what? And my goal with my poll questions are to kind of test you guys on stuff that you might see in a wastewater certification exam.
My poll questions were more asking about your guys' situations, but AJ's questions are a little harder. You had to be paying attention.
It looks like the answer is slowing down. It's been about a minute. If you want to show the results, Tucker. So it looks like most of us got this correct. These type of bacteria are facultative because they can use free oxygen. They typically use free oxygen as their preferred choice of a final electron receptor. And then in the event that there is no oxygen available, they do use other sources of oxygen, such as nitrates and sulfates. Thanks for showing that, Tucker. So with that, we'll actually start talking about our specific fixed media treatment processes. And the first we're going to talk about is trickling filters. So trickling filters are, like we said, it's a secondary process. So this is going to typically occur after screening and sedimentation processes. The wastewater is then treated with the trickling filter process. So during the trickling filter process, wastewater is continuously applied to the entire surface of a fixed film media by a distribution arm or sprinklers. There are microorganisms, as we said, in the fixed film that are utilized to um, consume the nutrients in the wastewater passing through the film, and they also utilize oxygen to grow and multiply. As the film thickens, microorganisms at the base of the film die off, and the microorganism film experience sloughing. The treated wastewater then passes through the media to drains at the bottom of the containment unit, and then the effluent passes on to the secondary clarifiers. One quick note, trickling filters can be a misleading term because we tend to think that means that solids are being strained out from the wastewater, but in actuality, what is happening is the organic matter in wastewater is being absorbed by the microorganisms in our fixed film. This is what a trickling filter tends to look like. So as you can see, this has our different components of our trickling filter. Now, trickling filters were originally arranged in kind of a field type configuration, and sometimes they're contained in rectangular basins, but more modern trickling filters are typically housed in cylinders such as this that look kind of like clarifiers. So this is, like I said, a cross section of that trickling filter that shows the components. What you can see is that wastewater is pumped in through that feed pipe, and then it makes its way up to the distribution arm, where that distribution arm is rotating and it's sprayed all over the filter. The water then trickles through the filter, which has a porous bottom with an air gap, and exits as if effluent. So you can see here that we have four main components of this trickling filter. We have the media, we have the distribution system, there's the containment structure, and then that under drain. So that makes sure that we have the ability to get the water in, the water is distributed, the water is treated, the whole process is housed, and then also the under drain removes the effluent as it is treated. So for context, here's how large trickling filters tend to be to treat large amounts of wastewater. As you can see, our trickling filter over here is over here in the bottom left. This is a trickling filter in Stockton, California. And you can see that we have cars all around it. We have buildings, and this thing will be able to house buildings or cars, and a large amount of them at that. So they're very massive, and they kind of have a larger footprint than what we think of as some of our other treatment processes. So now I'm going to talk about some of those components in more detail. So I want to first talk about the distribution systems. There can be two types. There is our fixed spray heads. These are similar to lawn sprinklers. They're kind of arranged in a pattern. They're not very common in the US, and they do require extensive piping systems that requires complex pumping and can be also have complex maintenance challenges because they have to be addressed more frequently. Then we also have a rotating distribution arm. The rotating distribution arm will have two or more horizontal pipes attached to an arm, and the water distributes through orifices on one side of the pipe. So the water will just on one side of the pipe will all be the same side of the pipe on each distribution arm. Typically, this is moved using force from that water distributing out of that side of the pipe. So that's why you have those orifices all on the same side. But it can also be controlled using a motorized mechanism. But really, the whole goal of this is just to make sure that you have a consistent hydraulic loading to your media of your clarifiers. And all these are designed for continuous flow, and they should not require any backwashing. This is what those systems look like. As you can see, for like a rectangular containment, you'd have these little sprinklers, and they're going to kind of show like that, just kind of sprinkling water out. And then for the rotary type, it rotates like this. So we can see that the water is spraying all in one direction, forcing it to rotate all in the same direction. So this is what that looks like up close. So you can see that the water is all coming out over there on the, let's call it the counterclockwise sides, causing this to move clockwise. And it will rotate around and spray onto this. This is a rock media filter. So after the distribution system, let's go ahead and talk about the trickling filter media. Um, so trickling filter media can either be natural rock or plastic. The original media was typically rock. And there are three key parameters that are used to determine the construction, operation, maintenance, and performance of the media. This is going to be our surface area, which is the measure of the area available for microorganisms to grow. Typically, the greater surface area will have the most potential for microorganisms to grow and has therefore the most treatment capacity. You can create more surface area by increasing the complexity of the different shapes that are used in the media. Then there's also the void ratio. This is the measure of the ratio of the voids to the volume of the solid media that is taken up. And this is calculated by measuring the amount of water in a basin with a known amount of media and dividing that volume of water used to fill the voids by the volume of rock or other type of media. And a high void ratio typically means there's more airflow and reduces the risk of clogging. Finally, the last parameter that we tend to look at for media is the dry weight. The dry weight is important because it influences the required containment structure needed to house the trickling filter. Lighter media requires less costly infrastructure, and trickling filters using lighter media can be built taller and handle more efficient organic loads. Our plastic media is typically an order of magnitude lighter than our rock media. What you're ideally looking for is a high surface area, a high void ratio, and lightweight for all of our filter media. And then, of course, affordability and durability. So again, just kind of showing up close, this is what that rock media will look like. Rock media was the original media used for trickling filters, like I mentioned earlier. Communities would, when these were first coming into fashion, communities would use the available rock sources in their nearby area, or even some case wooden slats. But for modern trickling filters, rock media is typically about 2.5 to 6 inches across and consists of crushed quarry material or river run material. The rocks must be graded and piled up correctly and with care to allow for continuous flow of water and air. Also, if you pile up too much heavy rocks on small rocks, they'll crush them and it defeats the purpose and flow cannot get through them. Another important fact about, or another important consideration for rock media is that it is prone to excessive cooling. It is not usually recommended for colder climates where freezing temperatures interfere with the biological activity of the trickling filter. Let me take a swig of water real quick if you want it before our next slide. So then the other type of filter media is our synthetic filter media, which is going to be our plastic media. The synthetic media started being developed in the 1950s and can be designed to maximize the efficiency of trickling filters, especially when compared to natural materials. And these are designed specifically to allow water to flow in specific ways that have been shown to maximize that treatment. So here are a couple of the characteristics associated with the different types of media. So like we said, the rock media is, oh, I'm sorry. So like we said, rock is rarely used in new installations these days, but there are legacy systems out there that still work fine as long as the rock is, they're using the correct rock types, they're using a durable material, and it is able to have the correct surface area and void ratio that's required. So as you can see, just in general, there's less surface area that tends to be available on the rock media, and it has a much heavier weight, like we said, a magnitude more. There are three different types of plastic media that are typically used for our synthetic media. which are called the random, vertical flow, and cross flow oriented plastic material. So as you can see, these have a much lighter weight, they have much more surface area, therefore they're able to treat wastewater more effectively. And in terms of the way that these different synthetic materials differ, random media typically consists of just single pieces of plastic randomly shaped and sized material. It's typically used to retrofit or directly replace rock media trickling filters. So they're good when surface area is more important than void ratio, such as when you have low concentration of organics and you're not worried about particles clogging up the surface. Now, new construction will typically use what we call the vertical and cross flow media. These are typically manufactured as a single continuous unit, like we mentioned, due to their low weight, and these can be much taller, such as high as 40 feet. Now, vertical flow media is typically recommended for high BOD loading applications, and this is because the water is going to go straight down. It's going to interact with lots of different, a high amount of surface area on that media. And you also have cross flow, which has channels in it that are 60 degrees or so from the horizontal, and they provide more turbulence than the vertical flow, which introduces more oxygen to the process and can treat that BOD more effectively. And it's used for lower hydraulic rates that can have more time to be that can be exposed to the bacteria that are going to be removing the BOD. Now, for the most part, though, these are typically arranged together. A lot of times you'll have your vertical flow that leads to your cross flow. So you get a lot, high amount of treatment, and then you get a more targeted treatment for this media. And now these cross flow and vertical flows look like this one on the right, which is the cross flow because it has all these different channels on it. But this is what that type of media will look like in function. So this is what the containment structures are going to be like for the trickling filter. And so like we said, the structures are going to be based on the material they're designed for. The rock media is typically going to be contained in a concrete or brick structure, which is going to be a lot shorter because that rock can be very heavy and it can break out of your containment structures. And then our cross and vertical flow media is going to be typically self-supported. So the sides of the structure don't have to be quite so strong. They might be made from something like fiberglass or steel and can be up to 40 feet tall, like we mentioned, and where the medium is about 20 feet. But then there will also be ventilation ports around the base to allow airflow. And these types of structures can also have mechanical vents to control the flow and kind of redistribute the pressure in the trickling filter. Finally, there is the underdrain. And the underdrain is designed to take the treated wastewater and the sloughed off biomass onto the next step in treatment, which is going to be a secondary clarifier. And the underdrains basically suspend the media off. You collect the media off of the last the base of the structure. One thing to point out, though, is that these underdrains can be large and hazardous, and sometimes they do need to have maintenance. So these will be considered a confined space. And so for safety precautions, you want to make sure that you treat them as a confined space and that when you are addressing them, that they're locked out and tagged out. Now, for operation, there are a couple different ways that these can be operated. So for a two-stage operation, these may be more shallow clarifiers, or I'm sorry, trickling filters. You would have the first stage of the trickling filter would remove BOD, and the second would perform nitrification. And this is because those facultative those facultative bacteria are outcompeted by our aerobic heterotrophic bacteria for nutrients. So if there's lots of food available and lots of oxygen available, those aerobic functions are going to take precedent, and they're going to break down the organic material in the first step of your wastewater treatment. And then nitrification is going to occur as um, that wastewater is treated and there's more oxygen available as like nitrates, and there's less BOD to treat. So so those facultative organisms are able to thrive more in that second stage. Then for a single stage operation, the same thing occurs, but it's more stratified. So BOD treatment occurs at the top where those organisms have more oxygen, they're hungry, and then at the lower steps where there's less oxygen and there's going to be other oxygen sources available, nitrification occurs to treat to remove any remaining organics. Then on top of staging them in terms of treatment, these can also be staged in a series fashion. In series, the first trickling filter is going to remove a majority of the BOD, while the second trickling filter acts more as a polishing process. This strategy is good for plants with a lower hydraulic loading rate that may need more biological treatment, more organic removal. Then there's also parallel treatment, and parallel operation splits up the influent flow, and each trickling filter will remove a similar BOD load. This configuration is useful for plants that have a high hydraulic load, and the trickling filters are able to meet treatment requirements on their own. Now, each individual plant is going to be different and have different design strategies, so changing the configurations can have different effects. So trickling filters are classified based on their applied organic loading rates or based on the kind of treatment that they do. And these are, and for the organic loading rate types, there's low rate, intermediate rate, and high rate. So these plants are decided to have so our first one is our low rate filters. These plants are typically designed to have a small amount of BOD and would not need combined processes for secondary treatment. These typically are able to remove a large amount of BOD because there's a slow rate going through, and they're able to consume all of that. In these type of filters, we have our aerobic and our facultative organisms that grow both effectively as well. And if you can see that we do not need a combined process required for secondary treatment. So that means that because we have our facultative bacteria and our aerobic bacteria, the aerobic bacteria consume BOD, and the facultative bacteria will go ahead and consume ammonia and nitrates. You also don't typically need a recirculation loop because there's only a low amount of BOD heading through these plants. And hydraulic rate, as you can see, is going to be higher on your plastic media because those media have a higher surface area and can treat more wastewater. Then we have our intermediate rate. As you can see that these types of filters remove less BOD, but this is because there's more sloughing occurring, and so you tend to have more solids pass through to the secondary clarifiers. And these type of trickling filters tend to have a deeper medium. This is because they are going to be treating wastewater at a faster rate, but because of this, you want to get it, faster contact, but it's not going to sit and remove as much BOD. And this sometimes needs to be treated with a secondary treatment, but for the most part, does not need to be treated with secondary treatment because it does have those facultative organisms, and also you're having a lot of BOD that seems to be passing through, but that is collected in the secondary clarifiers in the sloughing material, like we mentioned. Finally, we have our high rate filters, which are very tall and treat a higher hydraulic load or hydraulic load. And with these type of filters, They remove a lower amount of BOD than our other two, and these likely need to be combined with a secondary treatment. These are typically used to as a kind of almost like a pre-rinse, and that they treat like a bulk amount of BOD and they do it as quick as possible. Um, and then you would have a secondary process that polishes that off. And that leads to the concept of roughing filters, which do this at kind of an extreme level. Roughing filters are designed to let a substantial amount of BOD actually get through the system. They are typically used as a first stage biological treatment for plants that have a high BOD load. And such a, this may be used for preceding RBC or even a small activated sludge plant. Then there's also the nitrifying trickling filters. These are kind of high rate, and these will follow another biological process that treats most of the BOD. But they are allowed to, the bacteria that you have in here there's not going to be a lot of oxygen available in the, oh no, I'm sorry, you can have nitrogen or nitrates in here. Typically, you want nitrogen there so you can start to remove ammonia. So these are designed to remove that, have that ammonia removal and the BOD removal. So just real quick more about the nitrifying trickling filters. Typically, nitrifying with trickling filter is done in a two-stage process for optimization. Nitrification takes place in a single filter if for our lower rate trickling filters, but if you have those high rate trickling filters, you do have to have nitrifying that follows it. And here, those heterotrophic bacteria, that these are our single stage trickling filters that we talked about, where we have our heterotrophic bacteria which consume the BOD at the upper portion, and then you have autotrophic bacteria on the bottom, which use their own energy and remove ammonia. So those are our different types of trickling filters, but based on the trickling filters, all trickling filters should have sampling requirements, but these are some of those parameters that you look for understanding how to operate your trickling filter. So just like a lot of our biological processes and other processes for wastewater, you want to measure the TSS, the BOD, the COD, the DO, the pH, the temperature, the chlorine residual before dechlorinization, and your coliform bacteria after dechlorinization. And this is a chart that just kind of shows what those ranges should be, and where to sample those and how frequently to sample them. But basically, this is just showing this, with other processes, these are the ones you want to measure to understand what's coming into your plant and what's coming out and what may be on your MPDS permit. Now, for maintenance, here's a couple maintenance. This is a table of all the maintenance activities that are typically recommended, just some basic ones. So typically for your trickling filters, you want to check that the rotary distribution system is running smoothly when you're making your rounds. For maintenance, you want to check your bearing oil levels. You want to clean the distribution arm orifices, or at least verify that the water is being distributed correctly. You want to make sure that your rotational speed is correct on your distribution arms, and that it's consistent. And then sometimes you want to backwash or flush the distribution arms with wash water or pump water. And then you want to make sure that your distribution arms are level and they are not at a, like the axis isn't changing. And then also you can conduct pan tests to test the distribution of wastewater over your filter surfaces. Along with this, you want to also verify that your trickling filter has the correct thickness of your film, which is usually 0.1 to 0.2 millimeters. And that there's no unusual discoloration, there's no unusual ponding, there's no unusual odors. Odors a lot of the time are a result of anaerobic bacteria kind of outnumbering your aerobic processes. And this means that you may need to increase your recirculation to, or the speed of your distribution arm to increase more sloughing to encourage the growth of more new slime, or I'm sorry, new film. So also there's a couple mathematical concepts that we like to talk about in relation to our trickling filter performance. And these are going to be based on the design, the system operation, and the control. Now, a lot of time, like we said, the bacteria is responsible for treatment of the organics, but to calculate how well they're doing, a lot of times you want to calculate the organic loading rate and understand if you are overloading your microorganisms. You have to balance these things to control the growth of the microorganism film. So organic loading rate is typically calculated by dividing the flow, the influent flow per gallons per day, multiplying by our what's called our I can't think of the name. Why? Sorry, so it's in my mind. Tucker, what's the factor? The 3.785 liters over gallons. What do we call that? What kind of factor is that?
Well, conversion factor.
Conversion factor. Thank you. Sorry, I teach wastewater math all the time, in case anyone's wondering. But sorry. So it's multiplied by our flow into the tricking filter, by our conversion factor, by the BOD concentration, which would be calculated in the lab. Then we have a couple more conversion factors, and that will provide pounds of influent of BOD over the volume of our trickling filter per day. And if you calculate the flow already, or your this can be combined to if you're doing so the first one was in the metric system, and the second is with those conversion factors all combined to the imperial result. So the organic loading is going to be calculated typically by just taking in what's all your organic material from the raw or primary influent. So this diagram kind of shows that what's in blue is what's going to make up your organic loading. So it's all of the organic material that's in the water from the raw or primary effluent and in the flow. Then we also have our hydraulic loading. This is going to be the amount of water added to the amount of water in the influent added to the amount of water in our recirculation over our surface area. You're basically understanding how much water is going to be applied over the surface area of your media. And most plants do have recirculation, so you add that as well. And so this concept is everything in blue right here. So it's all of the hydraulic flow from your influent along with your recirculation flow. Then you can also calculate what's in your recirculation, and it's basically just the water that's leaving your trickling filter and what you're returning to the front of it. So everything kind of in red that's isolated without the raw influent. So recirculation is probably the most important parameter when it comes to effectively controlling our trickling filter process performance. It allows for operational flexibility by kind of removing that organic loading component versus the hydraulic loading, because you're kind of just reintroducing water and adding or decreasing how much liquid's actually flowing through the trickling filter. And it can impact the process in a variety of ways. So it produces hydraulic shear to slough solids. It can dilute the wastewater to lower our BOD concentrations. It can dilute toxic waste that might be received into the trickling filters. By decreasing your recirculation, you can increase the contact time of water in the filter. By increasing, you can increase hydraulic loading to reduce pests in your wastewater. It can help reseed the filter with microbes, provide uniform distribution of flow if you have a low influent coming in. It helps prevent the filters from drying out. It can return DO to the top of the filter. and it helps match the hydraulic loading rate to make it more consistent for what's required of the media itself. The recirculation rate is very simple to calculate. It is just going to be the flow recirculating versus the influent flow. The last parameter that we tend to calculate may be the dosing rate. And this is important parameter is used to control the biofilm thickness. It's essential in understanding if you need to increase sloughing or anything like that. All these concepts, we didn't really give any examples because we will be doing another wastewater math presentation in July. So if you want some practice with this, you can reach out to us or we can help you in that training as well. These are some typical dosing rates for our trickling filters. And it's kind of, it's going to change based on the organic loading rate. It's going to change the normal dosing rate and how much flushing or how many times their water is recirculated. And then just one more math concept is going to be the removal efficiency. And this is going to be the concentration of BOD coming into the plant, subtracting what's leaving the plant over the BOD concentration of the influent. And that just shows a percentage of how much BOD is removed by your trickling filter. Then some quick trickling filter troubleshooting concepts. So these are on the left is in a normal condition that may exist, such as odor or ponding, psychota, which is another name for our fly larvae, which is our most common pest animal that exists in our trickling filters. There's also freezing and debris accumulation. And on the right is a possible solution. And a lot of times for trickling filter, there may be chemical ways to address these, but a lot of times it's something as simple as increasing or decreasing recirculation. And as you study for your wastewater OpCert certifications, it's good to remember this. Another concept to think about or to remember, or to more like understand for trickling filters is that warm air and cool air flow differently through a trickling filter. In the summer, the warm air tends to settle and move towards the cool water, so that flow will go down. In the winter, the water is warmer than the air, so that air will move up out towards the cooler air. Real quick, some advantages and disadvantages of our trickling filters. Advantages is they are low energy requirements for our trickling filters. They have low maintenance requirements, and they have an ability to treat variable organic loads and toxic substances, especially when you are adjusting our recirculation rates. Some disadvantages is that they can generate odors, especially when anaerobic conditions are allowed to persist. They can have issues with macrofauna, such as insects, flies, snails, those psychota that we mentioned. And they have some temperature sensitivity. They ice over in cold weather. And then low flows can immobilize distributor arms in the systems without motorized distribution arms. So our next fixed film media process is going to be our rotating biological contactors, or RBCs. So our RBC process consists of wastewater flowing through a reactor containing a rotating media, or a drum. The rotating drum or module is made up of a series of closely spaced parallel discs designed to collect wastewater. Again, media grows on those rotating modules or drums. And as those modules rotate, the biofilm absorbs air and microorganisms that they use to consume biological material. Water then flows out of the drums and passes through the channel along with slough material. So again, this is a biological treatment, very similar to trickling filters. This is a picture taken from our Sacramento State Wastewater Treatment Guide, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with. And this shows where our RBC fits into the typical wastewater treatment process. Just like trickling filters, the RBC requires some pre-treatment, primary clarification, secondary clarification, solids handling, disinfection, and containment if necessary. The containment is useful as it can serve as odor control or to maintain climate control of the treatment process. Here are the components of the RBC. Typically, we have a concrete or steel tank, which is divided into bays by baffles. The tank holds the wastewater and allows the wastewater to remain in contact with the microorganisms treating the wastewater. Bays and baffles control the flow of wastewater, ensuring it is evenly distributed, it is flowing at the correct rate, and short circuiting does not occur. Then we have rotating material or drums that you can see here. You can see that they are parallel, like we discussed. So we have these parallel discs grouped into what we call a pack, and then we have a we have a shaft and a drive mechanism which facilitates the rotation of the media. Finally, there are also influent and effluent valves or channels that allow the wastewater in and treated wastewater out. Some systems will also have those under drains to remove solids that settle in the tank. The last part that is optional is for aerated RBCs, there's a distribution pipe that allows the introduction of mechanically created dissolved oxygen. So this is a closer look at what that shaft looks like. You can see that that motor is above the water level. Typical RBCs are submerged about 40%, but to experience nitrification, though, you typically have to submerge them about 70%. There are typically two types of drive assemblies that are associated with RBCs, and this may be drives that are mechanical or air-driven. Right here is a mechanically driven with a motor. The rotation speed for an RBC that you typically want to have is about 1.5 rotations per meter, which allows all the microorganisms to be exposed to food, and you allow water to flow down to the shaft from the surface of the RBC, and it can flow out at the correct rate as well. And oxygen is also allowed to move through the media correctly. So here's just a couple of different types of media characteristics. You can have standard density or high density RBCs. And really what the difference is how much surface area is available and how much biofilm will accumulate on these surfaces and what type of common use they'll have. So the standard density will typically have a BOD removal, whereas the high density with more microorganisms on there will also perform nitrification. So this is kind of showing some more perimeters. The main thing to notice about this is that the organic floating rate for RBCs is significantly lower than trickling filters, which can handle loads of up to about 25 pounds per 1,000 feet of surface area. So you can see that these are much lower. It's about 3 to 4 BOD. And then another difference is that another difference that's not called out here is that for BOD removal, only about 40% of the disc is typically submerged, whereas in nitrification, only setup you submerge the disc about 70 to 90%. So that's an important thing to remember about these as well. So here's just another quick picture of that, and you can see that they're quite large. And to submerge this and get some treatment, you would have this device installed right below that motor. These are some housing units that kind of show that your RBCs when they are kind of being climate controlled or odor controlled. That's what this kind of looks like. And again, just like trickling filters, you may have these operated in series or you may operate in parallel, and this is again going to be due to your hydraulic load. The hydraulic load, if you have a higher organic load, you may be running this in a series of a single train with 4 in a row, or you may have in parallel if you have a higher hydraulic load. And you also install baffles to kind of make sure that your flow is continuous and to make sure there's no short circuiting of your RBCs. Then the next design parameter is, if you have parallel versus perpendicular. For our parallel shaft, what tends to happen is you may have BOD removal at the first RBC, and then you would have nitrification occurring down the line towards the second RBC. Now, when you have them parallel to each other, this is typically for if you have an initial load that needs to be absorbed by a higher amount of biomass. So those perpendicular ones are going to absorb a lot of BOD in that first module. So again, this is kind of showing how the RBCs can be split up into, you can either have two in the same reactor, or you can split them up with a baffle. And this can kind of create some BOD removal in the first RBC and more nitrification in the second one. And this also prevents short circuiting, like we talked about. Here's an example of that being, the performance can be changed by adding those baffles for RBCs that are installed perpendicularly as well. This picture right here, like we said, is going to show our BOD removal occurring on the first stage of the RBC if it's installed perpendicularly. And then as on this darker side on the right, that's where nitrification is actually occurring. So the bacteria that are actually performing these functions are different colored. And when these are installed, you can kind of see that. So just a little bit of a quick operation maintenance. These are some of the tasks that you typically want to pay attention to for RBCs. You want to check for hot shafts and bearings to make sure that you're not going to get an RBC that breaks off. Also listening for unusual noises and shafts and bearings. You also want to make sure that you're maintaining grease on your drives and your shaft. You want to inspect the tane drives to make sure that the bearings and drive bearings are properly aligned. You also want to, every couple of months, change the oil to make sure that the parts of your RBC are properly lubricated. You want to make sure that your drains are correctly, that you're cleaning them correctly. And then also the motor bearings themselves should also be regularly greased. Finally, you want to also pay attention to the filter media, the under drains and the containment structures, as well as any pumps used to pump oxygen or water. Now, for troubleshooting, just like most biological treatment process, you want to kind of pay attention, and just like trickling filters, you want to pay attention to how much of your media is falling off, any odors that might be appearing, and then the appearance of your film. One thing to understand is that if there's odor, this may require chemical treatment. And then biological black film, this may mean that you have too much loading going into your RBC. And then if you have white biofilm, this may mean that you're not getting enough BOD removal and you want to add some aeration. And excessive sloughing is often the result of toxic substances that may need to be pre-treated for. These are a couple quick RBC parameters. A lot of time, just like trickling filters, you want to be able to calculate the hydraulic loading rate, the BOD, and then also for RBCs themselves, you're more likely to treat for nitrification and have a hydraulic retention time. So to calculate your organic loading rate, it's a similar math concept as in the trickling filters. Same with hydraulic loading rate. They're both measured, or organic loading rate is expressed in pounds of BOD over square footage of media, just like in trickling filters. And your hydraulic loading rate is also measured in the flow over your surface area. Also, you will want to calculate removal efficiency and recirculation, just like in our trickling filters. And then finally, some of the limitations of our RBCs is they are typically require low organic. They're typically more useful in low organic loading rates compared to trickling filters. And they don't provide as much flexibility as trickling filters because you can't manipulate our recirculation rates. And also because they can't handle a high amount and still remove a chunk of BOD, they can't be used as roughing filters or as high rate reactors. real quick, I'm just going to talk about our integrated fixed film activated sludge. So like we said, these are our moving bed biofilm reactors. This is what that kind of system would look at. Like, as you can see, this is um, a activated sludge basin, and it has our media in it. So this combines that fixed film process with activated sludge, and then the mobile media is placed in that aeration basin. This does increase the efficiency and decreases the footprint of our activated sludge. However, there's increased maintenance and more likely to be unwanted. Like you might possibly they're in the carriers. If they break down, they can end up in the effluent and stuff like that. So that's something that has to be monitored for with these types of um, processes.